I made it. Leah's efforts to get me here began several years ago, and I appreciate them greatly, especially now that I'm finally here. This is my first Sewanee, even though I've known some of you quite a while from this teaching writing circuit, or as I like to say, teach writing, see the world. I'm going to read something new tonight. It is a mix of old material and new material. And let's see, when my essay collection came out, I joked, for those of you who don't know me, it is called How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. And some people have called it a memoir and essays, and I remember saying something to the effect of, like, if I was really gonna write a memoir, it would be a bigger book than this. So, anyway, here we are. This book has had a couple of terrible titles over the years, but I think the one I've settled on is The Calligrapher's Grave. It's a reference to my grandmother, but the book is about me learning about my family as they die through the ways in which, and especially in Asian American families, Korean American families, there's so much intergenerational silence. One summer in the early aughts, my Uncle Bill arrived to New York City from Seoul, Korea, to campaign to become a member of the ILC, the International Law Commission at the UN. When I met up with him at his Koreatown hotel, the one he always stayed at while visiting New York, he told me he would be, if he was elected, the first Korean member ever. He was incredibly excited about this, and soon also very worried about it, and as we ate, he seemed to alternate between the two emotions. He repeated what he said whenever he saw me, that me, my brother, and my sister were like his children. As his younger brother, my father had been very close to him. My father had died when I was 15 years old, and Uncle Bill was the first to reassure us that he would be there for us out of all the members of our father's family. My father and he had been the first of their family to move to America, but he, unlike my dad, had moved back to Korea at the bidding of his father. He was dressed, as always, in his elegant uniform that never really varied. Khaki pants, tasseled loafers, chambray shirt, paisley ascot, navy blue button-down blazer with brass buttons or gold ones, a London fog overcoat. He often added a beret if it was cold, and a tasseled Burberry scarf. By the first time I remember seeing him dress this way, he had graduated from Georgetown Law, given up his career at the University of Virginia, and given up on becoming an American after his father ordered him home to Seoul in the late 1960s. He became a respected legal scholar there, taught at universities, and advised several of Korea's presidents on international treaty law, his specialty. So he arrived to this campaign in New York that week as a divorced single man living alone in Seoul, and this work was the work of his life. We used to laugh at his uniform, my siblings and I, but it is now my belief that these clothes held him together through all of this, something he was in control over that would not change. He would usually tell me at some point in any visit that he wanted to give it all up, move back to the US, and open up a fish and chips shop. I have no idea why, as he never ate them whenever we were together. The first time he said this, I thought he was joking, and he laughed when I laughed, but then argued the case for what a good life it would be. In any case, he did not mention the chip shop on this visit. This was instead the first time in my life I'd ever seen him excited about his own career. I said goodnight, took the train back to Brooklyn, and the next day he called me from an emergency room, telling me he thought he was having a heart attack, and he had had several by this time, and so he had gone to get himself checked out. I raced over from my apartment in the South Slope, meeting him in time for him to be discharged by a weary doctor who had found nothing wrong with him. He had once actually had a heart attack, and it was true he could have another one, but 5 times that week I received these phone calls from him, usually from an emergency room, but sometimes from his hotel room, telling me that he thought he was sure he was having another. I would race in again, and he would be, by then, in the company of another doctor who had told him, once again, that he was fine. And this continued all through the week of his campaign, until after the 5th one, as we went in a taxi back to his hotel, I said to him, "You are an incredibly smart man. You are a brilliant man, in fact, and you are so brilliant that you might even scare yourself to death, and you have to stop." He nodded in agreement. "You're very precise," he said, "just like your mother." The call stopped until he called to tell me he had won his campaign. We had a celebratory meal before he left, and he told me a story of his visit to the Chinese embassy. The Chinese ambassador had looked at his card and said, "Your last name is Chinese." And my uncle replied, "Well, yes, but we haven't lived in China for 600 years. The Chinese ambassador replied, 600 years is not such a very long time in China. You have our support." This support turned out to be key in his winning this position on the Law Commission. We are part of that group of Koreans who have Chinese ancestry, something I've had to explain in less graceful ways over the years, usually to Chinese people, cheerfully insisting to me, "You are Chinese," to which I have said only, "Sort of." The way my uncle explained it to me when I was young is that our original ancestor, as he is called, was a Mongolian general who married a Korean princess as a part of uniting Korea to the Mongolian Empire. This, of course, is a gross simplification of history offered by a grown man to a child. But what is apparent to me only now is what it would have meant for a Korean legal scholar to be part of the ILC, given the history of Korea in the 20th century as a former colony of Japan, always in Japan's shadow on the international stage, and given the role the UN had played in the colonization of Korea, as well as in the division of Korea that led to the Korean War. As someone who was born into Japanese colonial rule, who worked steadily on behalf of stateless Koreans abandoned in China, Russia, and Japan after that colonial rule ended at the end of World War II, it wasn't an empty honor to him. His whole life had been shaped by people wielding power like the kind he had just won. All that talk about a chip shop had been about him giving up on himself in this work, about the seeming impossibility of repairing or restoring whatever had been lost. After that week, whenever I told the story of him, I came to call him my heart attack uncle. I laughed at the story as I told it, thinking it was a story about a man who was smart enough to scare himself to death. Wasn't that ironic? But I had it wrong. I was watching him that week master his heart at last, after a life of letting other people rule it. Him on a tightrope made out of his life. Sometimes all of the answers to the mystery of someone are right in front of you to put together if you're paying attention. I knew he needed what had come to him at last. I saw him through it. I just wish I could tell him what his very precise nephew sees now. "You should write a novel about our family," this uncle said to me one night on one of his last visits before he died. It was a cold night in New York. I had finally come out to him and given him a copy of my first novel. "It would be a tragedy," he said. "It would be about a young man denied a brilliant career by his father." He meant to describe my dad, but I knew he was also describing himself. "A life cut short," he said, "too soon," and he paused there. "Okay," I said. "I will." I recently took a book in my office at home off my shelf, and to my surprise, when I opened it, a black and white photograph from my mother's college graduation flew out. I knew at once that during a disorganized move, I'd stuck it in there, knowing to keep it, but not knowing where to put it right then, and so there it had waited until now. In the photo, she is wearing her cap and gown and posed with a friend, laughing in some mock theatrical way, as if they are in a bad play and know it. My mother's mouth is dark with lipstick, which makes the pearls in her ears and the whites of her eyes and of her teeth all shine in the photo. Her blonde hair is perfectly curled and cut. I know my mother is a beauty, but I am also always forgetting it and then being reminded of it, as I was right then. I never knew her as a young girl. Never knew her when she was jumping into pools with her jeans on and sunning herself while they dried, so the fit would be perfect. The woman who rowed out to islands off the Maine coast with friends to chill kegs in the ocean is a stranger to me, laughing at me from these pictures. I know through stories and pictures only about the convertible car she drove to California with her friends, the way she piled her hair up on her head in a scarf, the redwood trees she drove through, her boyfriend in Malibu with the yacht, and the way she met my father. His drink was Crown Royal, his candy bar a Babe Ruth. Though he didn't like chocolate much, he was good at poker, loved reading Tolstoy, his suits were bespoke. In Korea, starting at the age of 5, he ran barefoot in the snow when he was training for this new martial art called Taekwondo, so he would be ready during the Korean War for when he and his eldest brother had to steal food from overturned army supply trucks, running the bags of rice home on their backs. After the war, he became an early international Taekwondo champion in his age group at the age of 18, captain of his college rugby team, and the founder of the English newspaper at his school. He left for the US while his father was away on business, so his father couldn't stop him. His mother gave him a gold belt buckle to sell when he arrived, as she couldn't give him money, and asked him, whatever he did, not to marry a blue-eyed, blonde-haired American girl. He moved in with his oldest brother, a student by then at Georgetown Law, and then left to go to the University of Brownsville, first living in Edinburgh, Texas, a few minutes away. He made his living there teaching karate and taekwondo. I have a photo of him flying through the air in a horseshoe kick, his legs and his arms stretched in front of him. He is breaking the boards they hold in the air with his snow-hardened feet. He transferred after a year to Pomona for engineering, and his students at Edinburgh sent him off to Azusa, California with a cowboy hat and cowboy boots. In his apartment building, he found my mother, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed American home economics teacher, working in the Los Angeles public school system and living upstairs from him. He crashed a party she was throwing, a buffet beside the pool in the center of their building's courtyard. He lived with 2 other Korean engineering students, and none of them could cook. She found him helping himself. "And you are?" she said. "Chuck," he said. "We go to the same church." "We do?" She asked. "I've never seen you there." "I enter from the side," he said, "and then I stand in the back." She accepted his offer of a ride that Sunday and rode to church with him for months. He was teaching Taekwondo in LA now and had celebrity students. Peter Fonda, for example, who set him up with his sister Jane, same name as my mom. When he came home from dates and he saw her light on, he would knock, coming in to tell her how they went, and it was never very well. She herself had a boyfriend at Duke, very far away. On her birthday, she received a dozen pink roses from the Duke man, and it was then my father appeared in her doorway. "Do you want to sit there and smell your roses, or can I buy you a drink?" He took her to a jazz club, and as they entered, the band began to play Happy Birthday. The maitre d' brought them to a table in front of the stage where a bottle of champagne sat on ice. As the band sang her name in the birthday song, she smiled and said to him, "What would you have done if I said no?" And he said, "But you didn't." And then he pulled out her chair. My father was a handsome man too, very charismatic, well-dressed. He looked good in a suit, and he knew it. I have a photo of him as a teenager with his mother, heartbreakingly beautiful to me, a thin, bronze-skinned boy with an elegant profile descending the stairs. By the time my mother had met him, he had turned himself into a kind of Southern California karate cowboy who drove to Tijuana to get drunk and crashed his car on the way back home every time. He had famous friends, actors who took his classes, and they liked to take his beat-up car to Hollywood parties with his friends who were also his students. They liked to see the valet's face when my dad's car drove up. It was 1962, and karate was the thing. He was hard to miss, in other words, in church or otherwise. After he died, my mother donated a piano to her church with a brass plaque on it, inscribed with his name. It seemed lonely to me as a gift. Growing up, I never saw him there. He never went there except at holidays, and apparently when he was courting. On the road up to Maine to help my mom clean my father's grave, I listened on the radio to a talk show host who insisted that those who were saying the war in Iraq was going badly are hurting the feelings of those who serve, and besides, it is going well, and a total success. He identified himself as someone who served in the first part of the war and paused in this way as he tried to describe how the beginning of the war was bungled, yes, but now it was going just great, and what was... I was tired of listening to people who didn't believe themselves, so I turned it off. I was in northern Massachusetts near the shore, but not at the shore, a place that has always seemed to me to be full of a kind of stifled rage. I stopped to use a bathroom, and yet as soon as I walked into the service station, I knew the woman behind the counter was going to tell me there was no bathroom and that she didn't know where I could go, and then she said it, and I left. No one seemed to have bathrooms anymore in 2006, not if they could avoid it. It seemed to me increasingly that this was the way to tell the truth about a country in its public bathrooms. Over the years, I'd noticed, in the US especially, every public bathroom looked like the scene of a tragedy or a crime or a lonely death, especially if they were along a highway. And if they did not look like they had already contained such a thing, they looked as if they might soon contain it, that such a thing was headed there. And now they were going away, as if by going away, the tragedy would find some other, lonelier home. Whenever I went to them on any road trip, no matter what I was thinking of prior, I thought of this. And so in some ways it was a relief to delay the moment in the bathroom whenever I could, even though I really had to go to the bathroom. The donut shop across the street seemed likely. I walked in and everyone looked up at me as if I was clearly trespassing. I ordered a donut despite being on a wheat-free diet, so that I might look like a legitimate customer. I added a coffee, which I really did want. I used the bathroom, and when I got back into my car, ate 2 guilty bites of the donut before eventually throwing it away under my mother's sink, 200 miles up the road. And on all of those miles, I looked down at the bag on the seat next to me and pushed away the thoughts about the bathroom. It felt as if everybody in that donut shop knew I would do that when I left with a donut, that they, like me, were tired of performed insincerity. The annual late spring visit to my father's grave is a slightly complicated one. Every year we find out if what we planted last year survived the winter, and then we go to the plant store. We wander a little dazedly in the heat to find something right. All the plants seem inappropriate to the grief itself. All around us are people doing the same thing, but some people at the plant shop are not. They are giddy, spring gardening. One woman stumbles around as if drunk, shouting, "I'm back to spend $500 more." This is a place I have known my whole life, the Estabrook greenhouse on Route 1 in Maine, and a sales clerk there tells us a car has caught fire on the turnpike, so the traffic is being routed here onto Route 1. When I look outside to see, it looks like an evacuation, like something terrible has happened to the whole state and everyone is heading south to escape it. My mother and I reject a number of choices, and then I pause and think, yet again, how much I dislike putting anything like a spade or a trowel or a shovel to the dirt around my father's grave. It feels like the wrong thing to do. But the alternative, doing nothing, seems somehow worse. I wonder briefly if they would have black-eyed Susans, his favorite flower, and then reject it as too natural to find at a garden store until I do. I search through a careful of other varieties that all seem too precious first. Flowers that look carefully made indoors that would quickly roughen and die out in the world. Many of these nearly artificial flowers do look incredible, but not for a grave. A very few look confused or even fake, strange colors and shapes, done weakly. I start to feel like we've begun a task we can never complete, which I often feel when we do this. My mother is trying to figure out what I like and directs me to things I've already rejected. The sales clerk near us looks kind, and so I ask his advice on flowers for a grave that overlooks a marsh. Okay, he says, you'd probably want something perennial that looks somewhat natural and fits in. We both nod. He points us to a few choices: a salvia, a sedum, a lavender, a geranium. And while I try to decide what will be best, he sets his hand on something and says, well, there's also black-eyed Susans. The plant comes into focus. It has not budded yet. If you didn't know, you could think it was a somewhat inauspicious wide-leaf green thing that could be anything. I put it in my hand immediately, comforted by finding it. And then the other choices are easier after that. We pay and leave, moving quickly into and out of the enormous line of traffic that borders the greenhouse. I don't know if my father would want this or not, I think, as we drive over. I can't tell. As I spray down his headstone and we scrub the lichen and mildew off from the long winter, I think about how he didn't want to be buried. He wanted to be cremated and his remains scattered over his favorite part of the ocean, off the Korean peninsula. But this was prevented by his sister and his father, and so he was buried here, far from there. Only the poor are cremated, his sister had said. What she had meant was, only the poor in Korea. They had wanted to build something I couldn't comprehend, something that involved a bust of my father and a grave mound, and it all had seemed so ridiculous to my mind. I had shrunk from it, and my thoughts couldn't quite return. All this was never what he wanted us to do, really, and that is never far from my mind when I do this, and so it feels dangerous for me to dig there, because really what I want to do is to do what he wanted. There's always the fear that I'll dig and not stop until I've dug him up and taken him to the place he wanted to be, his ashes in an urn in the overhead compartment as I fly to Korea and take the train down to Naruto. But of course, that idea of all these ideas is unbearable now, and so instead, there's this thing I can do with flowers that reminds me of what was not done and now never will be done and never really for him. I'll stop there.
Thank you to Leah and Gwen and Adam for having me. Adam, I am not wearing my lanyard right now because I'm feeling really vain about my outfit tonight, but I promise I will put it on afterwards, I promise. Vanity. I'm gonna start with a poem that partly takes place at a conference. It's called Great Material. There were the blue-tied garbage bags bulging with her dresses, then the buzz of June bugs on nights I sat on the roof alone and asked where my sister was until I felt stupid and stopped. What do you say to the dead? How can we rejoin them when we fall apart in the safety net below? Does she know her friends Lauren and Cameron played house after she died, set a place for her at a play dinner table? As though she might stop by for a few bites of air from empty plates with spoons empty of her short 7 years on this planet. It unbottles me how precisely they lamented her. What great material, the conference well-wisher said. Can't wait to read that poem. Here it is then, now. The crinkle of your laughter, the beetles pouring into your eyes as we toast you. Your own country. That wasn't the same day 2 towers staggered into the ground. You were warned they'd be hunting us, but you didn't want to be soft. There's a first day you learn a country can't be earned. Your heart's embarrassed, oof, it is soft. It isn't soft at all. A shiny pickup drives past. Go back to your own country, they holler. A firecracker lit, then thrown. There's a first day you learn ours and theirs. The girl with curious fingers says hello, her friends scorn. You'll get whatever they have. The skylight pours down all that white at home. What about the poor people in our country? Do you want to be like them? Is that it? Then go, go. There's a first day you learn how to kill yourself without dying. Your own country demands it. It isn't new. It isn't news. I got so anxious about the lanyard, I forgot to thank the rest of the staff, which was on my list of thank yous. But I wanted to shout out the rest of the staff, especially for your present and future dopeness and for making all of our days so much more pleasant and easy. Thank you. Self-portrait as Artemis. It wasn't long before I rose into the silk of my night robes and swilled the stars and the beetles back into sweetness. Even my fingernails carry my likeness, and I smudge the marrow of myself into light. I whisper, streetcar, ardor, midnight, into the ears of the soldier so he will forget everything but the eyes of the night nurse whose hair shines beneath the prow of her white cap. In the end, it is me he shipwrecks. Oh, arrow, My arms knot as I pluck the lone string totter, O crossbow. I kneel, he oozes, and the grasses and red wasp knock him back from my sight. The night braids my hair. I do not dream. I glow. This is a copy of my book. I always am giving away copies of my books. I don't like having my own books around. It's a weird, superstitious thing. But this is one that I've kind of like destroyed a little bit, and so there are poems I want to read, but I tore them out in a mood. So I'm looking for them, and they're just not here because I was moody one day. So I'm going to read a poem that is here, and it's the title poem of the collection, which is Registers of Illuminated Villages, and this is Register of Illuminated Villages. And it begins with a quote by Kanan Makia from an episode of Frontline, and the quote is, "I have a register which lists 397 eliminated villages, Kurdish villages in northern Iraq. The work is called the Register of Illuminated Villages. It's a very decorative, pretty thing." And the one thing I want to say about this poem is that this poem really made me feel like poetry really is time travel. Somewhere in this insomniac night, my life is beginning without me. In northern Iraq, it is high noon, the sun there, perched over fields shriven with lilies, the petals of orange poppies red with a light that a gauze of gray sparrows glides through over sheaves of bone too stubborn to burn, all that is left of those razed towns. A mother turns to a father in the cold room they share, offers her hands to his spine. I curl inside her, a silver bangle illuminated by candles' flame. I curl beside you, lay my head close to the vellum of your smooth back, and try again to sleep. Count to 1,000, you suggest. Count to 2, 3, as someone must count hacked date trees, hollowed hills paved into gardens, though the scholar on tonight's front line only counted each town destroyed, 397 of them. Who counts dolls, hand-stitched, face down in dirt? Count to 4, 5, 6. Count cadaver, stone, belongings, pots spun from red clay. Who will count the amputated hands of thieves? A mother presses a hand to me. Inside her, I thrash a stalk of wheat blistered by storm. Sleep comes, brief as it is bright. I startle, awake, turn to you. The register I know is real, fat with the names of the dead. Elegant strokes of sharp pencil etched into thick pages. A father presses an ear to a mother's belly. I am wide awake. Count to 7, 8, 9. You murmur, turn to me. Someone must be counting hours spent weaving lace the color of moonlight for a girl's dowry. But what right do I have to count hours, girls, dowries? Just the skin-thin pages of the good book I once cut a hollow into. Condoms I stored there, cigarettes. Count each minute I waited for them to fall asleep. Count nights I sat alone on the curb, held smoke inside my mouth, released whirls of it into the air. A father leaves a mother asleep on her side, the crocus of my fetus nestled inside. I draw over us the thin sheet. A father reaches for the Quran, thumbs through page after illuminated page, runs his finger beneath each line of verse, looks everywhere for the promise of my name. And And I'm going to close with a couple of new poems. How's everybody doing? Cool. Okay. This is called What Can Replace What I Lost? And that's something I overheard in Chicago at 3 o'clock in the morning. And you don't need to know what I was doing in Chicago at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's none of your business. What can replace what I lost? Once a spider came to rest upon my shoulder, or it was simply there all at once. I shall call it Chee. I said quietly at first, "There's a spider." Then, "There's a spider on me." I screamed, scrambled, and swiveled my sweater, the spider, off. Gone, spider Chee. The sun was shining, but who cares? Where there was just a shoulder had been a spider. I just had serious surgery on that shoulder. What was bone, now metal. Severely deformed, the surgeon's note said several times over. Severely deformed. Beautiful, she spider. Where has my spider gone? I now wondered. I looked for she, in the sweater, a helix of gnats, the blue side of a house, its blue shadow. No she. There is no home, I'd been concluding, but not sadly. Birds squabbling and shore leaves, green and wind-rippled as ever. German post-punk played on. The scene is what it's always been. But without she, daunting, repulsive, delicate. It must have been I who crushed she, unaccustomed as I was to eyeless, intimate proximity, to grotesque agility. You might be waiting to hear what she is an analogy for. You wish to know if I ever found she. No, she is not. And nothing can replace what you've lost. And this is my last poem, and thank you all so much. Irresistible. And it starts with a quote by Clarice Lispector. Whoever understands me is in error. I was a deer. A fawn? Deer still. No, I was dreary, dismal, a child. You find in your searching my antler nubs. They will never grow into weapons. My skull. I tried to drive my skull across the glass door. The grass on the other side was glassy with dew. And there I was, driving. I park at the river. It is not wilder than the hysteria of a winter spent restating the obvious. Perhaps you'd like to see a sprig of wisteria here. You would like for me to tell you it's okay. To resist is to refute want in its tracks. To resist is to withstand what means to make its way. You stop to stare. To stare is to see the stare to the one eye, no, not the third, but this one I expertly cut out, careful to clip each thick lash. I have finally had it with metaphor. A lie is also an equivalence. I was not irresistible, no, not to you, not then, not like now. You stare, but I am not opposed to being watched. Hush, wait for what's next. You'll talk yourself in, then out. You'll hesitate, only to clench the laced stays and scratched chains. Oh, I love how darkly, the dark, dark, dark. Why are you so dark, they said. I had simply asked how it was now. Bark then, bark, bark, dear, dear. Dear to me, they say, you are. I paste each roving eye into a corner. I grate each eye into the tomato salad. Come now. This is not your first taste of color. Thank you all.